The mansion on the hill had stood for centuries, long before the village below sprouted its first humble cottages. Its stone walls were blackened with age, the roof sagging beneath the weight of countless winters. But it was not the decay of time that kept the villagers at bay. It was the stories, whispers that clung to the shadows of the estate like damp mist on a grave. They said that a man once lived there, an alchemist of questionable morals, who sought forbidden knowledge and paid a terrible price. For years, the mansion sat empty, its windows like hollow eyes staring down at the valley, waiting. It was into this house that Martin Thorne, a man of science and skepticism, ventured. The storm had come suddenly, cutting through the late afternoon with a ferocity Martin hadn't expected. He had no choice but to take shelter in the mansion, though the mere sight of it had set a shiver deep in his bones. He wasn't superstitious. His work in chemistry and metallurgy had long since steered him away from such idle fears. But something about the mansion's silence unnerved him. It felt too complete, like a breath being held just out of earshot. Inside, the air was cold, musty with disuse, but surprisingly, the grand foyer remained intact. Old portraits lined the walls, their painted eyes following him as he moved deeper into the house. His lantern cast long, flickering shadows, distorting the faces in unnatural ways. He pushed open a door at the end of the hall and stepped into what must have been a library. The shelves were lined with tomes, many worn and crumbling, their spines cracked and unreadable. The fireplace, though long unused, still held the charred remains of ancient logs. Dust coated every surface, save for one peculiar spot, a desk near the far window. The dust there had been disturbed recently, and on the desk sat a book. Martin hesitated. The villagers had muttered of strange happenings when he first inquired about the house. Some claimed to have seen lights moving through the windows on moonless nights. Others swore they heard voices carried on the wind from the estate. Yet he had dismissed their tales, chalking them up to local superstition. Still, seeing the pristine book now, untouched by time, he could not shake the eerie feeling creeping up his spine. He approached the desk cautiously. The book was large, bound in cracked leather, and fastened with a rusted clasp. An intricate symbol was embossed on the cover, a serpent eating its own tail, an ancient sign of eternity. His hand trembled as he reached for it, though he didn't know why. The clasp came free with a metallic snap, and the book fell open. The pages were crisp, unnaturally so, filled with symbols and writing that seemed to shift under his gaze. It was Latin, but older, stranger, an incantation perhaps. And then on the fourth page, an illustration, a man standing beneath a darkened sky, holding aloft a vial of liquid black as night. Below it, in delicate script, were the words, Elixir Vitae, the key to eternal life. Martin's breath caught. Eternal life, the obsession of every scholar, priest, and king throughout the ages. But it was impossible, wasn't it? And yet, here it was, written in detail by hands long dead, waiting to be rediscovered. As he stared at the text, a faint rustling reached his ears. He turned quickly, expecting to see someone in the doorway, but there was no one. The sound came again, this time from above. A soft, persistent scratching like nails scraping against wood. The wind, surely. Martin shook off the unease, but the seed of dread had already been planted. Closing the book with a dull thud, he tucked it beneath his arm. The storm still raged outside, but Martin had no intention of leaving the mansion tonight. He had work to do. The scratching continued as he climbed the stairs, echoing through the empty halls. In the days that followed his discovery, Martin Thorne scarcely left the mansion. He spent every waking hour in the dim, candle-lit library, poring over the manuscript that had consumed his thoughts. The Latin, though obscure and archaic, was just within his grasp. The formulas it described were complex, blending alchemy and early chemistry in ways he had never seen before. Martin had long since abandoned the notion of magic, but the instructions felt disturbingly precise, rooted in science just twisted enough to seem possible. The elixir vitae, life eternal. The alchemist who had written the manuscript had clearly been brilliant, but mad. Each page was filled with a strange, feverish intensity. There were warnings, too, cryptic passages about the dangers of meddling with forces beyond human comprehension. Martin, of course, paid them little mind. The lure of the elixir was too great. The ingredients were obscure, many thought to be lost to time. But Martin was nothing if not resourceful. A mixture of mercury, lead, and sulfur formed the base, a dangerous concoction to anyone who knew chemistry. But there were other elements too, stranger ones. The powdered bones of an ancient creature, a black mineral mined from deep within the earth, and a rare herb that bloomed only in the moonlight. He had sent for these items from every corner of Europe, using the last of his dwindling fortune. It took weeks, but soon his makeshift laboratory in the mansion's cellar was brimming with jars, vials, and exotic compounds. He worked tirelessly, his hands stained with the grime of his experiments, eyes sunken from long nights with little sleep. But the house had begun to change. At first, Martin dismissed it as exhaustion. His mind, perhaps, was playing tricks on him. The scratching sounds, which had once come only from above, now seemed to echo from every direction. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, could sometimes be heard outside his study door. But when he checked, there was nothing. The air had grown colder too, though the chill didn't bother him as much as the weight of the atmosphere. It was oppressive, pressing down on his chest with a palpable heaviness, as if the house itself were alive, watching. Still, he worked on, undeterred. Finally, one evening, after countless failed attempts and burned mixtures, he held the elixir in his hands. It shimmered darkly in the vial, a black liquid that seemed to swallow the light around it. He stared at it for a long moment, mesmerized by the way it moved, thick and almost sentient, like a shadow made tangible. A deep unease crept into his mind. The manuscript had been clear. This was no ordinary potion. It would unlock something within the drinker, something beyond life and death. But there was always a price. Martin found himself lingering over that passage, the words twisted with warnings. Beware the shadow within. The storm outside had picked up again, the wind howling against the windows like a living thing. Martin's hand shook as he uncorked the vial. The elixir's scent was thick, metallic, tinged with sulfur. A shiver ran through him, but he couldn't stop now. He brought it to his lips. The liquid was cold, almost icy, as it slid down his throat. For a moment, nothing happened. He stood in the center of his lab, listening to the rain lash against the stone walls. Then, the first wave hit. His body seized, muscles locking as a terrible cold spread through him, turning his veins to ice. He gasped, but no sound came. Darkness pressed in from all sides, like a suffocating blanket, and for a brief, agonizing moment, he felt as though he were sinking, plunging into a deep, black ocean. But just as quickly it passed. Martin collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. He could still feel the elixir inside him, thrumming like a second heartbeat. He had done it. He had survived. But as he stood, he saw something flicker in the edge of his vision. A shadow. It darted just beyond the reach of the lantern light, a formless thing that seemed to writhe on the walls, watching him with invisible eyes. Martin blinked and it was gone. He shook his head, wiping the cold sweat from his brow. His vision blurred momentarily, but he steadied himself. It was nothing, just his mind playing tricks on him. But when he looked down at the table where the manuscript lay, a single page had turned on its own. His blood ran cold. There, at the bottom of the page, newly inked words had appeared beneath the final formula, words he had not seen before. The shadow has been awakened. Martin stumbled back, the shadows in the room stretching longer, darker. Something had changed within him, and within the house. The night the black moon rose, the air in the mansion thickened to an unnatural stillness, as though the house itself were holding its breath. Martin sat in the library, the manuscript open before him, yet he hadn't turned a page in hours. His fingers drummed restlessly on the arm of his chair. The elixir had done something to him. He could feel it crawling beneath his skin. Every breath he took seemed to echo louder than the last, and the walls around him felt closer with each passing moment. Outside, the storm had broken, leaving the sky heavy and dark. He knew tonight was significant. There had been mention of this lunar event in the manuscript, the Noctis Nigrum, a celestial phenomenon that only occurred once every few centuries. The Alchemist had written that the black moon would be the final key to understanding the elixir's true power, but the cryptic warnings that followed had unnerved him. When the black moon rises, the shadows will no longer be bound by flesh. Martin rose from his chair, pacing the length of the room. His reflection caught his eye in the window, though it was not quite right. The figure in the glass seemed thinner, darker, a silhouette more than a man. He stepped closer, squinting in the dim light, but as he did, the figure moved independently, tilting its head slightly in a way that he had not. He stumbled back, heart pounding as the shadow in the glass faded into nothingness. His hand shot to his throat, where the cold remnants of the elixir still pulsed through his veins. Was this the beginning? Was the shadow within him starting to surface? A hollow thump echoed from somewhere above, followed by the sound of scraping, like claws on wood. It had grown more frequent over the past few nights, that strange scratching, and though he had searched every room, he found no source for it. And yet, it persisted, growing closer, as if the sound were following him. The sensation of being watched was no longer ignorable. The house seemed to hum with a life of its own, its atmosphere heavy with expectation. Martin glanced at the manuscript again, eyes drawn to the sketch of the black moon, a perfect dark circle hovering over a man cloaked in shadow. He needed to act. Grabbing the lantern, Martin made his way toward the cellar. The air grew colder the deeper he descended, the stone walls damp and slick. His laboratory, a chaotic sprawl of beakers, books, and vials, was as he had left it, though the shadows now seemed to cling more stubbornly to the corners. He had once prided himself on rationality, but the events of the past few days had shaken him to his core. The manuscript had mentioned a ritual, a final experiment to unlock the true power of the elixir. The celestial alignment of the black moon would supposedly channel energies that could not otherwise be harnessed. As ridiculous as it sounded, Martin was no longer certain of anything. His only certainty was that something was terribly wrong, and this ritual was his only hope of regaining control. He hurriedly arranged the materials, careful to follow the precise instructions. A circle of salt, a burning candle of black wax, and the elixir itself, now poured into a shallow dish at the center of the circle. Martin stepped back, the ritual ready. He hesitated for only a moment before lighting the candle. The flames sputtered to life, unnaturally dark and cold, casting long, thin shadows that danced across the walls. The cellar seemed to grow even quieter, as though the world beyond had been swallowed by the blackness outside. Martin felt the air shift, the cold pressing in closer as the light from the candle dimmed further. And then, as the manuscript had predicted, the black moon rose. Its dark presence loomed in the sky, casting no light, yet its influence could be felt. A sudden, violent wind swept through the cellar, though no windows had been opened. The elixir in the dish trembled, its black surface rippling, and the shadows in the room seemed to deepen. A low whisper filled the air, barely audible but unmistakable. Words in a language Martin did not understand. His heartbeat quickened as he watched the shadows in the corners coalesce, pulling together like smoke. They shifted, rising, twisting into forms that resembled men, but far darker. Hollow-eyed, faceless things that moved with fluid grace. They gathered around the circle of salt, standing just outside its edge, swaying as though waiting for something. Martin's breath caught in his throat as he realized what they were. Manifestations of the shadow within him, the dark force he had unwittingly unleashed. Suddenly, the whispering grew louder, more insistent as the figures pressed closer. The shadows, no longer content with merely watching, seemed to stretch toward him, eager to breach the fragile barrier between them. Martin stepped back, his foot knocking over the black candle. It sputtered out with a sharp hiss. The cellar plunged into darkness. In that instant, the circle of salt broke, the shadows surged forward, and then came the scream. Martin's own, reverberating through the halls of the mansion as the dark forces finally claimed what had been promised. The black moon watched silently from above, uncaring. Martin awoke to darkness, thick, suffocating darkness that clung to him like a damp shroud. His body felt heavy, sluggish, as though the shadows themselves weighed him down. He struggled to sit up, the cold stone of the cellar floor biting into his palms. His heart pounded in his chest as fragments of the night returned to him. The black moon, the shadowy figures, the scream that seemed to have come from somewhere deep within his soul. For a moment he wasn't sure if he had survived. The shadows had surged forward, overtaking him. He remembered the sensation of being swallowed whole, dragged into an endless void. But now, in the silence that followed, he was alive, or so it seemed. His limbs ached, his skin cold and slick with sweat. But there was something else, too. Something far more unsettling. The shadows hadn't disappeared. They were inside him. Martin struggled to his feet, swaying as the room spun around him. The elixir, he could still feel its influence, like a low hum pulsing through his veins. It wasn't just his imagination. Something had awakened inside him that night. Something darker than he could have ever anticipated. He staggered toward the stairwell, the light from his lantern now nothing more than a faint, flickering glow. As he reached the top of the steps, a strange whispering sound echoed through the empty halls of the mansion. At first he thought it was the wind, but no. The whispers were coming from inside his head, like 1,000 voices murmuring just beyond the edge of comprehension. His breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. He rushed toward the mirror in the foyer, desperate for a glimpse of himself, to see if the shadows had taken their toll on his body. The reflection that greeted him was barely recognizable. His skin was pale, almost translucent, with dark veins visible just beneath the surface, like cracks in fragile porcelain. His eyes were sunken, ringed in shadow, and his pupils had dilated into inky pools of black. But the worst part was the movement behind his eyes. Something shifting there. Something that wasn't him. The longer he stared, the more the reflection seemed to change. His lips moved, though he had not spoken, and the face in the mirror twisted into a grim smile. It wasn't his face anymore. It was something else. A shadow masquerading as flesh. With a horrified gasp, he turned away, stumbling back into the dim hallway. The mansion had become a prison, each room a maze of whispers and flickering shadows. As he moved through the house, he noticed that the walls seemed to pulse with life, the once static air now thick with a sinister energy. The strange scraping sounds returned, growing louder, more insistent, like claws raking across the floor just out of sight. But there was no longer any point in searching for their source. He knew now what was causing them. The shadows were awake. They followed him, invisible yet always present, seeping through the cracks in the walls, curling at the edges of his vision. Sometimes he could see them move, long, spindly fingers reaching out from the darkness, creeping toward him before vanishing into the gloom. He could feel them too, a cold, breathless presence that pressed against his skin, like a thin veil separating him from whatever lurked just beyond the light. As he moved deeper into the mansion, the whispering grew louder. The voices, hundreds, thousands, echoed in his mind, fragments of ancient words, promises of knowledge, power, and eternal life. He covered his ears, but the sound persisted, rising to a fever pitch, until the very walls seemed to tremble with the force of it. Martin fell to his knees, gasping for breath. The manuscript's warnings flashed through his mind. The elixir had not merely unlocked eternal life, it had opened the door to something far older, far darker. The shadows weren't just following him. They were inside him, mingling with his soul, waiting for the right moment to consume him entirely. Desperation clawed at his thoughts. He couldn't let it end like this. He had come too far, sacrificed too much. There had to be a way to stop it, to reverse what he had unleashed. But deep down, he knew the truth. The alchemist had not merely sought immortality. He had bargained with forces that no man should ever disturb. Martin had done the same, and now he was paying the price. His body was no longer his own, and the shadows, they were growing stronger. He stumbled back to the library, his mind racing. There had to be something in the manuscript that could help him, some clue he had overlooked. He flipped frantically through the pages, but the words seemed to blur together, shifting and twisting in the dim candlelight. And then, as if in answer to his growing panic, the room fell silent. Martin looked up, his breath caught in his throat. Standing in the doorway, barely visible against the darkness, was a figure. Tall, thin, and cloaked in shadow. It had no face, no eyes, yet he could feel it watching him, studying him, and it whispered his name. Martin Thorne was no longer alone in the mansion. The shadows had come to claim their due. The mansion had fallen into an unnatural quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself is listening. Martin stood frozen in the library, his eyes locked on the figure in the doorway. A shadow made flesh. It didn't move, but its presence filled the room like a thick fog, pressing against his skin, suffocating him. He took a step back, his heart pounding, but the figure remained still. The whispering had stopped, but Martin could feel the shadows curling around him, creeping toward him like tendrils in the dark. He blinked, and the figure was gone. Martin's knees nearly buckled with relief, but his pulse didn't slow. The shadows were playing with him, teasing the edges of his sanity. He knew he couldn't stay in the library, not with that thing lurking just beyond the door. He needed answers, and there was only one place left to search: the alchemist's private chambers, the one part of the house he had avoided since arriving. He grabbed his lantern, the dim flame flickering weakly, as though it too were afraid of the darkness that had taken hold. The house groaned around him as he stepped into the hallway, his footsteps echoing off the walls. His eyes darted to the mirrors as he passed, those ancient, dust-covered relics that lined the corridor. They had always unnerved him, the way they seemed to hold shadows even when there was no light. But now, they felt alive, as if they were waiting for him to notice something he had missed before. He paused at the largest mirror, its surface cracked and fogged with age. His reflection stared back at him, hollow-eyed and pale. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it, a flicker of movement. Slowly, cautiously, he turned to face the mirror fully. The reflection shifted. His own image seemed to warp, darkening at the edges until it wasn't him anymore. The figure standing in the mirror was taller, thinner, its face blurred and shadowed. Martin took a step back, heart hammering against his ribs, but the figure in the mirror didn't move with him. It stayed, watching, and then it smiled. Martin recoiled, stumbling backward as the reflection pressed a hand against the glass, as if testing the barrier that separated it from the real world. The air in the hallway thickened with a sudden chill, and the lantern in his hand flickered wildly. The shadow in the mirror leaned closer, its mouth moving soundlessly, but Martin didn't need to hear the words to understand. It wanted out. With a strangled cry, he turned and fled down the hallway, the sound of his own panicked breathing echoing in his ears. The mirrors on either side of him seemed to swell with darkness as he passed, the reflections shifting and distorting, shadowy figures reaching toward him from behind the glass. They whispered his name, their voices merging into a soft chorus of promises and threats. "Martin, come closer. We see you." His vision blurred as he ran, but he forced himself to focus, heading toward the Alchemist's chambers. The door loomed ahead, an imposing slab of dark wood with intricate carvings that seemed to writhe under his gaze. His hands shook as he grasped the brass handle, pushing it open with a creak. The room beyond was untouched by time, as though the alchemist had only just left it moments before. A massive bed, draped in thick, moth-eaten curtains, dominated one corner, while a grand desk, cluttered with yellowed papers and glass vials, took up the other. But it was the large, gilt-framed mirror above the desk that drew Martin's attention. The mirror was different from the others in the house, larger, more ornate. Its frame was carved with strange symbols, barely visible beneath the layers of dust and grime. But the glass itself was flawless, untouched by age, reflecting the room with a sharp, unsettling clarity. Martin approached it slowly, his heart racing. As he stood before it, the whispers returned, louder this time, filling his head until he thought his skull might split. His own reflection stared back at him, but there was something wrong with it, something not quite human anymore. His eyes were too dark, too wide, and the shadows behind him seemed to pulse, growing closer with every breath. Suddenly, the figure from the hallway reappeared in the reflection, standing directly behind him. Martin's blood turned to ice. He whipped around, but the room behind him was empty. When he looked back at the mirror, the figure had stepped closer, its hand pressed against the glass. He felt a pull, deep and instinctual, as though the mirror was calling him, begging him to step closer. His breath hitched as the figure's dark, hollow eyes locked onto his. The glass began to ripple like water, the barrier between his world and the shadows thinning. Before he could stop himself, his hand reached out, trembling, toward the surface of the mirror. The glass felt cool beneath his fingertips, but it began to give, bending inward like a membrane ready to burst. The mirror wanted him. The shadows wanted him. Martin snatched his hand back, breaking the connection. The whispering ceased, and the mirror stilled, its surface returning to an ordinary reflection. But Martin knew, deep down, that he had come dangerously close to crossing a line he could never return from. The shadows in the mirror were waiting for him. And next time, they would not let him go so easily. The mansion had become a tomb. The oppressive weight of the shadows was suffocating now, and Martin knew he was running out of time. The reflection in the mirror had shown him what was coming, what he was becoming. He could feel the darkness inside him growing stronger with each passing hour, pulling him closer to something far worse than death. The elixir had promised eternal life, but it had given him something else entirely. It had unlocked a doorway between worlds, and now the shadows were clawing their way through. But Martin wasn't ready to give in. Not yet. He staggered back to the cellar, his heart pounding as he descended the stairs. The flickering light from his lantern cast twisted shadows on the walls, but he ignored them. His mind was racing, piecing together the fragments of the manuscript's final chapters. There had been hints of a way to reverse the process, a final transmutation that could undo the horrors he had unleashed. But the ritual was dangerous, far more dangerous than the elixir itself. And it required a price, one he wasn't sure he was willing to pay. The cellar was cold, damp, and filled with the remnants of his failed experiments. Broken vials, blackened flasks, and scorched notes littered the stone floor. At the center of the room, the ritual circle from the night of the black moon was still intact, though its lines had smudged, disturbed by his panicked escape. Martin bent over it, frantically rearranging the symbols, his fingers trembling as he worked. The shadows in the corners of the room whispered to him, mocking his efforts. He could feel them watching, waiting. The final transmutation, according to the manuscript, required a binding, a sacrifice to seal the door that had been opened between the worlds. Martin's eyes flicked to the shelf where he kept the remaining vials of the elixir. He grabbed one and held it up to the flickering light. The black liquid inside seemed to pulse, almost alive, as if it were aware of his intentions. The ritual required him to drink the elixir again, but this time he would not be using it to prolong his life. This time, the elixir would be the key to trapping the shadows, binding them within him, and closing the doorway for good. But there was a cost, one that had been whispered in half-forgotten legends. The ritual would consume his soul. Martin's hands shook as he poured the elixir into the small dish at the center of the circle. The smell of sulfur and decay filled the air, making him gag. He lit the candles around the circle, their dim flames barely piercing the thick darkness that pressed against him from all sides. His mind raced. Could he really go through with this? Was there no other way? He had already lost so much. His health, his sanity, his very reflection. But if he didn't act, the shadows would consume more than just him. They would spread beyond the mansion, into the world, corrupting everything in their path. He couldn't let that happen. Martin knelt at the edge of the circle, the manuscript's final page spread open before him. The Latin words were scrawled in shaky, erratic handwriting, as though the alchemist who had written them had been on the edge of madness. Perhaps he had. Martin's voice trembled as he began to chant, the ancient syllables thick and guttural on his tongue. The air in the room shifted, the temperature dropping rapidly as the shadows crept closer. They gathered just beyond the circle, their shapes twisting and writhing, no longer content to watch. They wanted him, needed him. He could feel their hunger, a gnawing void that threatened to pull him under. The ritual's chant grew louder, faster, the words spilling from Martin's lips as if pulled from some deep well of knowledge he hadn't known existed. The elixir in the dish began to bubble and hiss, its dark surface rippling with an unnatural energy. The shadows pressed against the circle's edge, but they couldn't cross. Yet. Martin reached the final words of the incantation, his voice barely a whisper now. With trembling hands, he lifted the dish to his lips. The smell was overwhelming, acrid and metallic, but he drank deeply, the black liquid burning as it slid down his throat. For a moment, nothing happened. The shadows around him seemed to pause, the air thick with anticipation. Then the pain hit. Martin's body convulsed, his muscles locking as a searing heat exploded within him. He fell to the floor, gasping, his vision blurring. The shadows surged forward, drawn to him, their dark tendrils wrapping around his limbs, pulling him into their grasp. His skin burned, his veins pulsing with the elixir's dark energy. The shadows howled, a deafening roar that filled the room as they pressed into him, merging with his flesh. The ritual was working, but it was also tearing him apart. Martin screamed, his voice echoing through the mansion as the shadows consumed him. His body twisted, contorted, the darkness sinking deeper into his soul. He could feel them, the countless voices, the ancient forces, the very essence of the shadows themselves, binding to him, sealing the doorway shut. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The room fell deathly silent. Martin lay on the cold stone floor, his body broken, his mind shattered. The shadows were gone, sealed within him, trapped for eternity.